information will turn around soon, and you'll be back to normal. This is a session I actually presented or co-presented at Trailhead X 21 a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to replay the whole presentation and run through it with you. It's fairly high level introduction to Salesforce DX. If there's an appetite to go deeper in any particular areas, please just reach out to your group leaders, Vamsi and Yanis, and ask them, and they can contact me, and I'm more than happy to come back and do another session and go into more detail. So it wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation without a forward-looking statement. We will be talking about stuff that is in beta, pilot, and on the roadmap, so please make your purchasing decisions based on currently available products and features. I co-presented this with Nick Rao at the previous session. He's not joining me for this. Hopefully I can do his section justice. A little bit about myself. I'm a senior program architect at Salesforce, based in Melbourne. Program architects, in one line, help our customers accelerate their time to value. So we're typically embedded with a customer for 6 to 12 months to help them and their partners get the most platform. In my spare time, I like to follow most sports, but particularly ones with an oval ball, rugby union, rugby league, and now footy, since I arrived in Australia in January. I joined Salesforce in November, back in London, and moved to Melbourne in January. Before we get started, we've got a good attendance on this meeting, so thank you for joining. Perhaps you can drop into the chat for everybody to see a little bit about yourself. I can see people already saying hello, a bit about your role. Is your dev process org-based or source control-based, and what brought you to this session? So I see we've got some people from Wellington, Salt Lake City. Oh, good evening, Salt Lake City. So we're global. California, Bay Area, another Melburnian and another Melburnian, some people from Brisbane. Mr. Best, good to see you on the session. Org-based development. Okay, so should be some good stuff for you in this session. AFL team, okay. There's a long story to this, but I follow the Pies. I'm a season ticket holder for Collingwood. Not doing quite so well this season, but they did well against the Tigers at the weekend. Don't beat me up too much about Soccer. Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, I always follow English football teams, and we're used to being disliked, so following Collingwood is probably quite comfortable for me. Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move on, but thank you for all the messages in the chat channel. So beg your pardon. Let's go back to the right page. I've lost something. Bear with me. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so the agenda is we're going to go through a very high-level Salesforce DX feature overview, and then we'll talk a bit about org versus source-based development. I can see there's a mix of types in the attendees, and a bit about how packaging and adoption is of use, and then we'll wrap up and I'll share some resources with you. So Salesforce DX, so it isn't one thing. Salesforce DX is a collection of processes, tools, technologies that bring Salesforce development into the current century and follow familiar models that developers would be used to in other enterprise software development environments. So the first thing is that it helps with team collaboration. We'll come on to the source, your version control system being your source of truth. So teams can collaborate on projects, they can collaborate on packages, which we'll come on to as well. And the metadata and the code is much more modular in Salesforce DX. So Salesforce DX introduced source format metadata as an alternative to the legacy metadata API format. If you're used to working with the metadata API and tools like the Ant Developer Toolkit, Migration Toolkit, Visual Studio Code, you'll know that when you're working with a package.xml file and you pull the metadata out of your org and store it in metadata API format on your local machine, you look at it, it's very monolithic. So if you take a compound metadata component like a custom object, one XML file will have everything to do with that component in there. So it'll have the custom fields, the page layouts, the validation rules, everything in one file. With source format metadata files, things are broken out into separate files. So each of the fields is a separate file. Each of the page layouts is a separate file. And this helps in a number of ways. When you're synchronizing your metadata between your local project, your local Salesforce DX project, and your org, then less information needs to be transferred backwards and forwards. If you're using source tracking, which we'll come on to, only the changed files will go up and down. But it also helps you with packaging. When we talk about packaging a bit later on in the presentation, you can break your customization or your application down into multiple packages. So you could have a base package which has got the custom components in, and then you can have extension packages which have the fields and the page layouts, etc. So this allows teams to collaborate more effectively as well, because they can work on smaller pieces of metadata. Everything is driven from source code. So at the heart of Salesforce DX is the assumption that you're going to connect to a version control system, and that's going to become your source of truth rather than your org being a source of truth. Again, we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. Salesforce DX introduced a new type of org, a scratch org, which is ephemeral. It can exist for a relatively short period of time, between 1 and 30 days, and can be spun up and destroyed very easily. The whole of Salesforce DX is based on open standards and extensibility, and Salesforce DX itself is open source, and I'll give you a link to the GitHub repo where you can go and actually have a look at it. Processes and tools facilitate continuous delivery, because one of the tools that comes with Salesforce DX is the Salesforce command line interface, CLI, that can be powered from your CI/CD server of choice, whether that's Gearset, AutoRabbit, Capado, etc. And the packaging model and paradigm supports a more agile distribution model. Instead of having to deploy everything into an org, you can deploy smaller pieces of packaging. And again, we'll come on to packaging and adoption in a bit more detail in a moment. So as I mentioned, scratch orgs were introduced by Salesforce DX. Ephemeral, they could be spun up for between 1 and 30 days. And the great thing about a scratch org is that you can shape it to be as close as possible to your production org, or it can be, you can enable just individual features and settings in there as if you had purchased those features and settings in your production org. So you're quite familiar with using sandboxes, so the features and settings that are in your production org appear into your sandbox. But you can't turn on additional features and settings. You have to buy those, put them in your production org, and then pull them out into your sandbox. The great thing about scratch orgs is you can enable whatever features you want. So you can try before you buy, see whether the new customization or application that you're developing, which depends on a particular feature, you can figure out how to make that work in advance. To be able to create and manage the life cycle of scratch orgs, you need a developer hub. A developer hub is an org where the dev hub feature has been enabled. So you could spin up a trial dev hub to act as your dev hub for your projects, or you can turn it on in a developer edition org. But what most people do is turn it on in their production org. And once you've got the Dev Hub turned on, you can give developers access to the Dev Hub. And once they've got access to the Dev Hub, they can start creating and using and destroying scratch orgs. So the Dev Hub helps keep track of the life cycle of all the orgs that you've created and are active at any one time. But it also keeps track of all the packaging. So, and we'll come on to that in a moment. And it also keeps track of namespace registries. So when you're developing packages, you can have them namespace so that every metadata component's API name is unique across the whole of Salesforce. And that's achieved by linking namespace registries to the Dev Hub. So the Dev Hub is quite an important part of the Salesforce DX application lifecycle. So one of the questions that always comes up is like, when do I use a scratch org and when do I use a sandbox? And it's not a binary answer, I'm afraid. It all depends on what you're achieving, what your development team looks like, what their skill set is, etc. Whatever, we always say that you should do your integration testing, your user acceptance testing, performance testing, etc. in partial copy and full copy sandboxes. Leading up to that, you can choose to use Scratch orgs, developer edition orgs, developer sandboxes, developer pro sandboxes, depending on what your development lifecycle is. But as I mentioned earlier, a really good use case for Scratch orgs is trying out new features. If you don't want to replicate the whole of your production environment in a Scratch org just to do a bit of development, then you can create the Scratch org, put the dependencies in there that you need to be able to develop your feature. A good reason for using a sandbox is if you're depending on a lot of existing metadata components and configuration in your production org, lots of page layouts and permission sets, profiles, etc., then it's probably better to use a sandbox. So unfortunately, I can't give you a black and white answer for that, and it does depend. But as you start using Salesforce DX, you start to get a feel of when to use Scratch orgs versus sandboxes, and that decision is the options open to you have increased recently because Salesforce DX has introduced source tracked sandboxes as well, which behave a bit like Scratch orgs in terms of source code control and synchronization. You get a certain number of Scratch orgs, which varies depending on the edition that you have, varying from the developer edition where you can create 6 Scratch orgs a day and have 3 active at any one time, all the way up to performance and unlimited editions where you can create 200 a day and have 100 active at any one time. But you can also purchase more Scratch orgs if you require. I don't think I have a slide in it, but I think I'll probably just spend a moment going back to here and talk about the difference between source tracked and non-source tracked orgs. So it's almost like a matrix. Down one side, you've got source tracking or non-source tracking. At the top, you've got ephemeral orgs and persistent orgs. So an ephemeral org is a Scratch org. It exists for a short period of time. Then your persistent orgs are things like developer edition orgs or sandboxes or your production orgs, things that last for a long period of time. Down the left-hand side of the matrix, you've got source tracking and non-source tracking. So source tracking can be enabled in sandboxes now, as of the previous release, and it's on by default in Scratch orgs. That's what one of the key features of a Scratch org. And when you've got source tracking, then Salesforce DX keeps track of the changes that you've made in your org and in your local Salesforce DX project. And then you can synchronize those by doing pushes and pulls, and only the changes get pushed or pulled in either direction. If you have a non-source tracked org, so that could be in persistent orgs, so in a sandbox which does not have source tracking enabled, or in a production org, then you don't have source tracking. So it falls back to using the metadata API, package.xml files under the hood, and you push and pull all of the metadata that you instruct the Salesforce CLI to push, to deploy and retrieve for you. So one of the benefits of using Scratch orgs and sandboxes with source tracking enabled is that it keeps track of everything for you. You don't have to go and update a package.xml file, for example. And because, if you remember, I was saying about source format metadata files are much more granular, that whole process is much faster than it used to be for deploying everything via the metadata API. Salesforce CLI, I've mentioned those. I've mentioned it a few times already. So it's the command line interface. You can execute, once you've got the Salesforce DX and the CLI installed, you can execute this from any terminal window. And it's the namespace is Force, and it's got a number of topics, and the topics are Apex, MD API limits, all the things you can see in the screenshot on the right-hand side. So via the API, via the CLI, you can spin up and destroy scratch orgs. You can authenticate against persistent orgs. So one of the benefits of getting going with Salesforce, the Salesforce CLI, if you only did this as a performance benefit in your daily work, is that you can authorize persistent orgs like Sandboxes, production orgs, developer edition orgs, and give them an alias in the CLI. So then you could have a list of orgs with meaningful aliases, and then you can open up those orgs in your browser by just executing sfdx space force org open and then the alias, and it will open it for you. So that is an immediate benefit. CLI can also be used for pushing and pulling source tracked code changes between your local Salesforce DX project and your source tracked org. So that's a scratch org or a sandbox with source tracking enabled. Or you can deploy and retrieve, which is like the old metadata API format, to persistent orgs like Sandboxes, developer edition orgs, and production orgs. You can execute commands to build the scaffolding for common development components like Apex classes, Apex triggers, Lightning web components. And there are commands for managing the life cycle of packages. So you can create packages, create package versions, install packages, etc. You can even execute anonymous Apex, and you can build SQL queries in here as well, load test data. You can do everything from the command line. So you can see how when you then drive this via a CI/CD server, how it can automate a lot of those repetitive tasks that you have in your application lifecycle. There have been a number of development environments historically, but the one of choice, the go-to development environment these days, is Visual Studio Code from Microsoft. It's open source, it's free, and a plugin has been developed which you can get on the Visual Studio Code marketplace called the Salesforce Extension Pack for Visual Studio Code, which adds a lot of capabilities to working with Salesforce DX. So you can, let's take a drink. You can continue to execute the CLI commands from the command line via the integrated terminal, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there. But you can also execute shortcuts to commands via the command palette, via the context menus of the various folders, etc. You can see which version control system you're connected to down the bottom left-hand corner. It's a bit small, but you can see the sort of branch icon in the bottom left-hand corner. It's actually on the master at the moment. You can see what the default org is that you're connected to as well. So when you're pushing and pulling, deploying and retrieving code, then by default it will do it to that org. So it's a great productivity tool. Okay, so which components of DX excite you? I mean, some people have used it already. You may have heard some new things there. And what sort of development challenges are you looking to solve? So Adrian just started using GitHub Actions to develop some CI/CD functionality. Great. Dip your toe in the water. Start executing some of those Salesforce DX commands via that. Looking forward to dig into unmanaged packages. Okay, so I'll get on to packaging in a moment. I suspect that you mean unlocked packages rather than unmanaged packages, but I'll explain the difference between the two. I get tongue-tied and say that I say unmanaged way too often instead of unlocked. Yeah, that's what it meant. Cool. Great. Okay, so moving on. Org versus source-based development. So org-driven development is where the org is your system of truth. It's where the golden record of all your metadata components exists. So the most obvious version of that is when you're working with change sets. and your production org is the source of truth. And if you want to be in a development environment that reflects that source of truth, then you create sandboxes that mimic the production environment. And you move changes between sandboxes that have been created from the same production org, or between sandboxes and the production org, by using change sets, inbound connectors, outbound connectors, and change sets. Another version of that is when you've used the metadata API and tools like the AMP Migration Toolkit, where you still have the production orgs as your source of truth, but to move data between different orgs, particularly ones that aren't created by using sandboxes from a common production org, you pull your data, your metadata components using the metadata API, and then you deploy them to the orgs that you want to develop in. If you move to source-driven development, the version control system becomes the system of truth, and you pull the metadata components that you want to work on out of the version control system and put it into the orgs that you want to do development in. And when you're ready to deploy to production, you deploy from your version control system into your production org. And you can see how this is much more aligned to like the CI/CD toolset paradigm, where you can integrate this whole workflow into a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. Sometimes you'll also hear the terms development models, which makes this diagram a little bit more confusing. But if you hear about change set development model, org development model, and package development model, again, it's just a different lens on the same way of doing things. So obviously the change set development model is when you're using change sets. The org development model, you probably still have a version control system, which is the source of truth, but you're using the metadata API and you're using persistent orgs to do your development. So that, that's very common with ISV developers who are developing App Exchange apps, to use that model historically. And of course, the package development model is where you start using Scratch orgs, you start developing second generation managed packages, which I'll come on to, and unlock packages as well. So you'll hear both source-driven development, org-driven development. Again, it's almost like a matrix. Another lens on that is change set development model, and package development model, and org development model. Okay, I think in the interest of time, because I am a little bit behind time, I'll press on. So packaging and adoption. So if you look at a production org that's been developed over a period of time, it's typically got two sources of metadata in there. It's got metadata that's been packaged up into a managed package and installed from App Exchange. So a managed package is like the container that an ISV development partner will use to package up their application so you can install it into your production org in one installation step. There'll be configuration steps afterwards, but it's one command to actually install all of that metadata into your production org. Managed packages are versioned, so you can upgrade previous versions with later versions. And the code in a managed package is obfuscated, so you can't see it, you can't change it, and that protects IPR, but it also prevents a packaged application from being broken by people tinkering with the innards of the application. On the other hand, you've got your unpackaged metadata, which has found its way into your production org either via change sets or via the metadata API, and this is what we call the happy soup. It's all of that metadata, it's swimming around in your production org. It's really hard to see and to join the dots between the different metadata components to say, well, these components make up this customization, or these components make up this particular application that we developed internally and pushed to our production org. And it's hard to see the history of the changes. The change history tends to be kept either out in the in a spreadsheet if you're using change sets, or it's in your version control system if you've started using that. But it would be great if you had a combination of of both, the ability to be able to install metadata as packages, as containers, but for it not to be obfuscated. And that's where unlocked packages come in. So unlocked packages, like managed packages, are containers for functionally related metadata components. Like managed packages, they're also versioned. So you can upgrade a previous version to add additional functionality and changes. Unlike managed packages, the contents are not obfuscated, so you can go in and change the components if you want. So you have to be careful about doing that in a production org, and obviously the best practice is to replicate the change that you've made in your production org in your source, so that next time you produce the next version of your unlocked package, it will have that change in there as well. So just to go back to Eric's point about unmanaged packages. So unmanaged packages are a bit like unlocked packages, but they're not versions. So they were introduced to allow companies to develop templates, particularly for open source projects that can be put onto AppExchange, but there's no version control in it at all. You can see the content, so you can modify it, and you can't do any upgrades. You can't install a later version of an unmanaged package over a previous one. You have to uninstall everything and then install the later version. So it's never ever recommended for deploying metadata components to a production org. It simply acts as a template or a starting point for developing a new application. So if you've got a huge bowl of happy soup and you've got a rich legacy of updates to your production org, where do you start? How do you start compartmentalizing these metadata components into packages? There's two ways of doing that. There is the functional layer or a combination of those. So by functional, I mean, take your production org, look at functional areas. They may be, you may have a multi-cloud environment. So you've got Service Cloud, Sales Cloud, Experience Cloud. You may want to start packaging around those clouds to extend and evolve their functionality. Or you may have particular business functions within your company, and you may want to start packaging up around the business unit or the business function, or you may want to start packaging up around specific apps to do a particular function. Another way to start segmenting up all of this happy soup is by doing layers and following the model view controller model that Salesforce has, or adopting Andrew Fawcett's enterprise architecture patterns, for example, and doing it in layers. So you can have a layer for the data for all your custom objects. You can have a layer for your business logic, and then another layer for UI. What typically happens is you have a combination of both, but the key thing is whether you're starting greenfield or you're trying to unpick some happy soup, is to step back and think about what your strategy is going to be. For smaller organizations, it may be sufficient to put all of your metadata in one unlocked package. So you've got everything under some sort of control. Okay, again, better trot on in the interest of time. So as with most things with Salesforce, it's a massive environment. There's so many options, there's so many things that you can do, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can establish a beachhead, you can dip your toe in the water, you can then start to expand from there. So, I recommend that you start using Salesforce CLI and Visual Studio Code, becoming comfortable with that. You could just start, as I said, by authenticating a lot of your persistent orgs and using that to be able to connect and open them up easily. You can start working with a version control system for Visual Studio Code, so you can start switching your branches, etc. Start adopting version control as well, and start spinning up scratch orgs, and start taking some of those individual CLI commands and then packaging them together into batch batch files to start with, and then start integrating it with your CI/CD server, and then start looking at your modular development with projects and or packages, and start identifying something in your happy soup that you can start pulling apart. It may be some common functionality, it may be some new things that you're developing, but start looking at ways of carving up some of that happy soup into smaller packages. And rest assured, this whole tool set is being invested in massively, and it's got a very rich roadmap. Unfortunately, can't share all of it. I will share some in a moment, but this is an area that's being invested in very heavily. So this is the whole process, the whole tool chain is evolving and improving very rapidly. Okay, so I'll wrap up and then leave some time for some questions. What's new? I said I'll talk about some stuff that's coming on. I mentioned it earlier, Salesforce CLI is open source, so you can go to the GitHub repo, you can even fork it and start making your own, tweaking it, making your own changes if you like. Sockwheel Builder and the new Sockwheel language server are now GA. So if you're used to working with Workbench and the query builder in there, you can now do a very similar thing directly within Visual Studio Code. And with the language server, it also does autocomplete and identifies errors in your query as well. Apex code coverage improvements have been made. So if you have used the CLI to execute Apex tests, you'll know that there's two things. Firstly, the results tended to be, the coverage tended to be a bit different than what you saw in the developer console, and a bit different to what you saw when you pushed to prod and the tests were executed. And the second thing was the level of detail around those errors wasn't particularly good, but that's been improved. So now the numbers that you get from the Apex tests will be the same as what you see in the developer console, and the same as what you'll see when you deploy to prod. And the test coverage result output is much better as well. Financial, if you're used to doing a lot of development, a lot of customization, you quite often revert to using debug logs. And unpicking a debug, multiple debug logs can be quite challenging. Financial Force had developed a plugin for Visual Studio Code, which allow you to graphically analyze those logs and surface that information up in a much more digestible way. And they've kindly made it available to the community, so you can go to the Visual Studio Code marketplace and you can install the Apex log analyzer from there. Org-dependent unlock packages are now available. One of the things I didn't talk about with unlock packages was the fact that you can have dependencies between unlock packages. I touched upon it very, very early on when I was talking about custom objects and compound components. But you can develop multiple unlock packages. So you could, for example, have a base package which has got like common functionality in, and then you can have specific extension package for particular use cases. So for example, if you're developing for Service Cloud, you've got different digital channels, and you may have a common base package for all the digital channels, and then you may have a channel specific piece of functionality which knows how to work with social customer service or chat or email, for example. So you can have these dependencies, but sometimes what we found was that people wanted to have dependencies in their unlock packages on metadata components that already exist in the production org. So you can now build those dependencies into those unlock packages. I talked about managed packages that ISV developers use to develop apps for distribution via App Exchange. Historically, we now call those first generation managed packages. They're monolithic packages, and you need a persistent org called a packaging org to be able to develop those managed packages and to release them. Salesforce CLI has some support for first generation managed packages, but because of the dependency on this persistent org, it doesn't allow you to do package creation. It does allow you to create new versions of the package, and it does allow you to install those packages from the command line for testing purposes. But Salesforce DX introduced second generation managed packages, which, like unlock packages, means that you can develop multiple packages and have dependencies between them. but they're also obfuscated and versioned like unlock packages, but they're obfuscated unlike unlock packages. So and because it doesn't depend on this packaging org, you can do everything via Scratch orgs if you wanted to. So the whole end-to-end life cycle of developing packaging orgs, second generation packages can be done from Salesforce CLI. And what's gone GA recently is the ability, like with first generation managed packages, where you could schedule push upgrades to customers to receive the new version of your managed package, and you could select who those customers are and when you wanted the push to happen. You can now do the same thing with second generation managed packages and also unlock packages. So you can schedule push upgrades of your unlock packages into your production orgs at particular times. On the roadmap, there's a lot of work going on under the hood to improve the performance of the source commands. So what that means is in the Salesforce CLI, if you wanted to work with source format metadata files and with source tracked orgs like Scratch orgs and Sandboxes with source tracking enabled, you would use the source topic of commands. So you would enter something like SFDX space force : source : push to push your metadata changes to an org. And a new library is available, which operates and executes much faster. There are plans for adding destructive changes to source.deploy. So source.deploy is used for deploying source format metadata to a non-source tracked org, like your production environment. And deploy uses under the hood the metadata API to do that deployment. If you're used to working with the AMP migration toolkit and package.xml, then you can have a destructive changes XML file, which you use to delete metadata components in your org, and that's being added to the source deploy command. We're working on improving the conflict detection between local orgs and local environments and your org. So if somebody's made some changes in the orgs that you are synchronizing with, and you've made some changes within your local Salesforce DX project, then the ability to detect those conflicts and resolve those conflicts is being worked on and improved. DevOps Center is really exciting. It's an alternative to chain sets and gives you a declarative way of seeing within the Salesforce UI what changes have been made to metadata components and which ones you want to pull into your production environment. And in packaging, for those who've worked with first generation managed packages, removing components from those packages is a complex process, multi-stage. You first have to disable them, deploy them, ask administrators to remove usage of them, and then you can remove them from a later package, and it's quite complex. With second generation managed packages, we're working on component removal as being a seamless process. Okay, so the takeaways, get stuck in, start using the CLI. Google Salesforce CLI and Salesforce DX, and you'll find all of the installation instructions to be able to install and start using the CLI and Visual Studio Code. Get used to using version control and moving away from your org being your source of truth to your version control system being your source of truth. Start using Scratch orgs, even if it's just for developing small features and customizations and trying out new features and settings that you don't have in your prod org. Start working on defining a packaging strategy, so you know whether you want to package and segment vertically, horizontally, or a mixture of the both. And iterate and improve, like most things. As soon as you start using it and become familiar with it, it becomes second nature. There's a lot of resources out there to help. You can start on Trailhead. There's a lot of trails and modules on there that you can start working through. And of course, there's the usual gamut of documentation, blog posts, and videos. And if you're a Premier customer on Premier Success Program, you can use a DX accelerator and get access to that to start accelerating your use of DX. And of course, there's the tools and there's communities as well that you can join to collaborate with your peers. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that we're all aware that we're in challenging times, particularly up in Sydney and Queensland. So there's a ton of resources available from Salesforce that are free. If you go to the website below, that's got everything about how to reopen your offices safely, how to teleconference effectively, etc. So there's lots of material out there that has been made available by Salesforce to help you. Okay, Ramsey.
That's great, Ivan. Right on time.
Yeah.
I was looking at the clock and then about to ping you, but yep, right on time. So we have 15 minutes, and there's been some conversation in the chat. Let's quickly go through, and I would encourage anyone, if you have any further questions, please post it in the chat. We'll go through in the same order. A few conversations which has already been picked up by Adam, Adrian. So where do you want to start? There's a question from Johan, which is around post-deploy class. Any plan to fix the post-deploy class for the GP upgrades?
Unfortunately, I'm not from the product team, so I'm not ideally placed to be able to answer, bugs and features, apart from the ones that I've shared with you, because the product team kindly gave those slides to us so that we could share them with you. So I'm really sorry, but I'm not in a position to be able to answer that question. Sorry.
There's one from Adrian. Anyone use DX scale? But I'll probably make it generic. If you have anything around DX scale that you want to share, discuss.
DX scale. I don't know what DX scale is. I've not heard of that. Some things I do know about that DX scale has put out. Right. Okay. Oh, so I thought it had a different name to that, but yeah, they've developed a whole bunch of tools around Salesforce CLI, as have other companies as well. I mean, the Salesforce.org team use Salesforce DX to produce their not-for-profit success pack, their non-profit success pack, and they've come up with a bunch of tooling called Cumulus CI, which wraps Salesforce CLI to do common tasks. So they've got actions which map onto commands and flows which can do common things like spin up a scratch or create some test data, add some users, install managed packages, etc. So I don't know the detail about DX scale. I do know what you're talking about now. I've seen some of our customers who use that, but I don't know what the plans are for that. Sorry, I don't have more data.
But that's a good insight from you, Adrian, on the DX scale part. I think it helps some of the community members to have a look at them. And thanks for sharing the link, Adam. You're always the best. So, yep, can see no other questions. Anyone else, if you have any questions, please feel free to post it in the chat. Or anything you got back from your Trailhead DX session, Ivan, if you would like to share any key feedback that's been observed during your Trailhead DX.
Yeah, it was a really good experience personally to present. I did 3 sessions because we were in Australia. They were delivered in the middle of the night, but I guess that what surprised me a lot is the level of adoption of Salesforce DX and how it's relatively low at the moment, but it's accelerating. And I think the product team within Salesforce recognize that as well, which is why the investment is going on as well. There were a bunch of questions about when's bug X, feature Y going to happen. Again, we weren't in a position to be able to answer that, but there was a session from the product team at Trailhead DX where they did talk in a bit more detail about the roadmap and about some of the things that they're looking to fix. So if we can find that, Vamsi, I'll see if I can dig it out and share it with you, so you can share it with the community.
Yep. I will be sharing the recording and the slide deck, and if you have any additional content, pass it on to me. I'll publish that in the community group. There's one from Aravind, how to reduce dependency coupling of 2GP managed package.
Yeah, so there are a number of challenges with DX at the moment. This is one of them. Other challenges are the amount of time it takes to spin up a scratch org that's got a large amount of metadata in it. There is work going on about doing sort of shaping, automatic shaping of scratch orgs to match production orgs, but Aravind, this challenge that you're talking about here is something I've heard several times, and Adam and myself, who are Adam's on in the forum as well at the moment. We've got some conversations going on with the product team. So although I don't have the answer to your question, if you've got challenges like this, these are exactly the sorts of things that Adam and I have been surfacing up to the product team, and we can do that on your behalf, and they'd welcome it. So you can feel free to use us as a bit of a conduit to send these challenges through. We can be the voice of the customer and feed that back into the product team.
Yep, that's the last one I can see in the list. Let me just go up just to make sure we don't miss anything. I think you've already seen the chat between Digambar and Adrian.
So as I said at the beginning, if you'd like some sessions that go a bit deeper into particular areas, because we did skim across a whole ton of material there, or if you want to do some demos or anything, just let me know. We'll actually let Vamsi and Yanis know, and more than happy to rock up and do something that's a little bit more meaty. Okay, and the last thing before everybody goes, just a quick plug. I am writing a book on Salesforce DX. Should be out by the end of the year. So keep an eye out for that.
That's good to know, Ivan. Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining in and listening to Ivan on the DX and asking insightful questions. Hopefully we'll share the recording and the deck before end of this week, and I'll be organizing another one in the next 4 to 6 weeks. See you all again.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
thank
everyone.
you, Vamsi, for having me. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.